The stately hush inside Portwood City's grand courthouse deepened the moment Elinor Reyes rose from the defendant's table. She was in her mid-40s, composed and poised, dressed in a charcoal gray blazer that fit snugly around her shoulders. Lines of experience and resolve traced the edges of her eyes, reflecting a life devoted to seeking justice. The watchful gazes of the audience trailed her every move. On the opposite side of the room sat Officer Clark Freedman, arms folded, his expression tinged with disdain. His lawyer leaned in, whispering instructions, but he simply snorted in response. Elinor cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the same practiced calm she'd employed in countless courtrooms. "Before we proceed, I believe it's important I disclose who I am and what I do." Her words brought a ripple of unease over the gallery. Freedman's dark blue eyes narrowed, a subtle panic flickering beneath his scowl. The judge, an older figure with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, nodded her encouragement. "I'm not simply a defendant in this case," Elinor stated, lips tightening at the corners. "I serve as an investigative journalist. I specialize in uncovering abuses of power within public institutions." A collective hush descended. Freedman's smugness fizzled to blank tension. Across the room, spectators exchanged startled glances. The judge's face remained stoic, but her grip on the gavel tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Reyes," she said evenly, "are you suggesting that the plaintiff filed this suit without realizing he dragged an established journalist into court?" Elinor allowed a small smile to form, though the determination blazing in her gaze was anything but pleasant. "That does appear to be the case, Your Honor, and I suspect it's about to become incredibly relevant." Freedman's attorney looked ready to combust. Freedman himself chewed on the inside of his cheek, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Somewhere in the back row, a spectator let out a low whistle as though anticipating a storm. Elinor calmly resumed her seat, listening as the gavel summoned a hush over the murmuring crowd. A few months prior, she could never have anticipated finding herself in the defendant's chair. In her mid-40s, Elinor had weathered many conflicts, political exposés, high-stakes interviews, even subtle threats from well-connected individuals. But she'd assumed somewhat naively that local police officers who peddled intimidation would prove a more straightforward challenge. She hadn't counted on crossing paths with someone like Clark Freedman. It happened on a blazing hot afternoon. Elinor had just wrapped up a lunch with friends in Portwood's bustling downtown. Her sedan was parked on a side street, resting safely beneath the shade of a large oak tree. As she approached, Freedman's squad car screeched around the corner, lights flashing in an over-the-top display of authority. "Hey, you?" came Freedman's bark. He planted a hand on his holster as if Elinor were brandishing a weapon. Without allowing herself to flinch, Elinor raised both palms. "Yes, officer?" Freedman's stance broadcasted suspicion and maybe even a hint of thrill. "Reports of a vehicle break-in around here," he said, voice edged in accusations. "You match the description." Elinor gestured calmly to her well-maintained car, each word measured. "I'm the owner. I have my registration. Can I show it to you?" He cut her off, loud and harsh. "Put your hands on the hood." His partner hovered silently near the rear bumper of the squad car, arms crossed, offering no encouragement or restraint. Elinor obeyed. She could sense Freedman's frustration when his rough search produced nothing suspicious. With a pointed grimace, he took her wallet, rifled through it, and tossed it back. "Consider yourself warned," he said in a dismissive tone. "Stay out of trouble." No apology, no acknowledgement. Elinor's jaw clenched as she took the flimsy citation Freedman handed her. The name on his badge seared itself into her mind, awakening that instinctive curiosity she had developed from years of investigative work. To Freedman, she might have appeared an ordinary citizen. He had no clue that beneath her calm exterior lay the fierce determination of a journalist, adept at exposing corruption. A week later, Freedman blindsided her with a civil lawsuit claiming she'd defamed him. According to his allegations, she'd followed up that traffic stop by threatening his livelihood and making false, slanderous statements about him. None of it was true, of course. Yet Elinor recognized the officer's motive. bury her in legal complications, shut her up, and possibly extort some kind of settlement. Elinor's closest friends urged her to let it go, or better yet, settle quietly. They dreaded the wave of trouble Freedman might summon through his connections. But Elinor had been hunting stories of corruption for so long, she saw this as an irresistible lead. Freedman had chosen the wrong target. Little did he realize that by suing her, he had invited the glare of an unrelenting investigative spotlight. Hence, she found herself in that courtroom. Freedman's face told the story. As soon as Elinor revealed her true profession, he knew he'd walked into a trap. But she was only getting started. During a brief recess, Freedman and his attorney argued in hushed, frantic whispers. Elinor didn't need to overhear them to guess their panic. The judge had offered Freedman's side a moment to regroup or potentially withdraw the lawsuit. Freedman's pride, however, refused the lifeline. His attorney returned to the courtroom, grim-faced, but announced that they would continue. Elinor sat with her defense counsel, Marcella Dunbar, a razor-sharp attorney with a reputation for dismantling nonsense cases. Marcella leaned in. "They haven't tried to settle or walk away. Freedman must think he can outbluff us, but he's shaken." Elinor smirked. "There is no idea how deep we can dig." She recalled every painstaking step she'd taken to collect evidence over the past few weeks. By the time Freedman's lawsuit was served, Elinor had already begun rummaging through public records, speaking to fellow journalists, even contacting a few seasoned activists who specialized in policing issues. What she discovered was more disgusting than she'd imagined. Freedman had an extensive pattern of filing petty lawsuits, always targeting people who dared speak up against him, usually overshadowing them with his uniform and his inflated sense of authority. And then there were the harassment complaints that never went anywhere. "Incident was deemed unsubstantiated," read the official remarks. Case after case, an echo of the same bureaucratic shrug. Her greatest concern was that Freedman might have powerful allies. No single officer, however brazen, could repeatedly file frivolous suits and harass citizens without institutional cover. The more Elinor learned, the more certain she grew that Freedman wasn't acting alone. Perhaps that was the real story. Freedman as a cog in a broader machine of corruption. Her gut burned with the realization that exposing Freedman might only scratch the surface. She'd hidden her cards carefully, revealing little in her initial replies to Freedman's legal complaint, and now, in court, Freedman was at an abrupt disadvantage. The officer tried to paint her as a reckless journalist who'd threatened him, but as the cross-examination began, Freedman couldn't produce a single text or email or witness corroborating his story. Marcella made quick work of him. "Officer Freedman, can you cite any specific statements Ms. Reyes made that you found threatening?" He hesitated, cheeks reddening. "She said I'd regret this." Marcella lifted a brow. "Those were her exact words?" He coughed. "Something like that? And you interpreted this as a direct threat against your safety?" Marcella's voice dropped to a dangerous softness. "Yes," Freedman mumbled, glaring. Marcella stared him down, letting a long pause coil in the air. Finally, she turned to the jury. "No further questions." Freedman slumped off the witness stand. Elinor's expression remained a carefully controlled mask, though her heart hammered with satisfaction. His attempt at intimidation was laughably thin. Yet she knew Freedman wasn't finished. Fearful people, cornered people, those with secrets to hide tended to strike back with desperation. When court adjourned for the day, Freedman brushed past Elinor in the hallway, his voice so low it barely carried. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he hissed. She paused in mid-step, her reply steady. "You'd be surprised what I know." Marcella gently touched Elinor's elbow, guiding her away. "Careful," the attorney warned. "He's losing ground, and that kind of person can be unpredictable." Elinor nodded, a flicker of nerves in her chest. "I've faced bullies before, but I'll watch my back." That evening, alone in her cluttered apartment, Elinor clicked through digital records of Freedman's history once again. Court transcripts, internal complaints, obscure references from local activists. A text from Marcella caught her attention. "Just got body cam footage. Prepare yourself." Elinor's stomach tightened. She opened the file on her laptop. The image quality was grainy but clear enough to show Freedman's posture, aggressive, overbearing, on the day he'd stopped her by her car. She could hear the venom in his tone, the condescension as he barked orders, ignoring every calm explanation she offered. The clip ended. Already her blood pounded with indignation. Freedman was worse than she'd realized. That short footage alone revealed an attitude so dismissive it bordered on hateful. If Freedman had readily displayed that hostility on camera, Elinor could only imagine how he treated people without documentation. She slept restlessly that night, haunted by images of Freedman's sneer. Through half-lidded dreams, she kept seeing the terror in the eyes of individuals Freedman might have silenced. By morning, she'd steeled herself for another day in court, and she had no idea how quickly everything would escalate. The next morning, the courthouse overflowed with observers. Word had spread that a local journalist, known for shining a relentless beam on malfeasance, was now the defendant in a curious defamation case. Freedman arrived early, looking uncharacteristically tense. He kept huddling with his lawyer, who whispered behind a thick folder. Elinor's gaze swept the jurors as they took their seats, noticing their growing curiosity. This wasn't a typical small claims case. Sparks of intrigue bristled in the air. The judge invited Freedman's counsel to call their next witness. Freedman's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Officer Patricia Kirsch to the stand." Freedman's longtime colleague took the oath and approached the witness box. Her demeanor was composed, though her clenched jaw betrayed nerves. Freedman's lawyer walked her through basic questions, painting Freedman as a good officer, conscientious, misunderstood. Kirsch solemnly agreed. She insisted Elinor had been uncooperative during the stop, though she barely hid the tremor in her voice. She tried to depict Freedman's conduct as appropriate under the circumstances. Elinor listened calmly, waiting as Marcella rose to cross-examine. "Officer Kirsch," Marcella began, her voice a fluid mixture of courtesy and steel, "you testified that Ms. Reyes was uncooperative. Can you define what uncooperative means in this context?" Kirsch swallowed. She questioned Clark's authority. Officer Freedman's authority. "Asking why she was being detained is, to your mind, uncooperative?" Marcella's question held a gentle challenge. Kirsch paused. "Well, it was the tone," she said feebly. Marcella's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "In your recollection, did Ms. Reyes shout, swear, or make explicit threats?" Kirsch shook her head, eyes flicking sideways. "No, not exactly." "Thank you," Marcella said, glancing meaningfully at the jury. "Now, you also claim Freedman's behavior was appropriate. Do you believe using demeaning language or slurs is ever appropriate for an officer?" The hush in the courtroom was sudden and intense. Kirsch paled. She angled a desperate glance at Freedman, who refused to meet her eyes. "No, slurs wouldn't be appropriate," she managed softly. Marcella held her gaze. "Did Freedman use any disparaging terms that day?" Kirsch opened her mouth, then closed it, face growing blotchy. "I don't recall." Marcella pressed a button on her laptop. "Your Honor, permission to play new evidence." The judge nodded. The lights dimmed and the body cam footage flickered across the screen. Freedman's voice rang out, dripping contempt. "Another one of you troublemakers thinking you're above the law. Maybe I ought to haul you in just for your attitude." An audible gasp rippled through the audience. Marcella paused the video at Freedman's sneering profile, then stepped forward. "Officer Kirsch, would you like to revise your statement about Freedman's appropriate conduct?" Kirsch stared at the screen, lips trembling. I just didn't think of it as a slur," she stammered, as though searching for an excuse. Marcella let a long silence hang. Then she nodded politely. No further questions. The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. Reporters scribbled furiously. Freedman sat ramrod straight, fists on the table. The judge instructed everyone to break for lunch. Freedman abruptly left the courtroom, ignoring the barrage of questions from onlookers. Elinor felt a tug of apprehension. She had landed a decisive blow with that video, but Freedman's stony exit hinted at brewing desperation. Marcella gave her a firm nod of approval, but her eyes carried worry. "Stay alert," she murmured. "He won't take this lightly." They ate a quick lunch in the cafeteria, quietly discussing trial strategy. Marcella revealed she'd discovered something intriguing in Freedman's personnel files, a suspicious number of formal complaints that never went anywhere. Kearse's half-hearted testimony was just the tip of the iceberg. Freedman's pattern seemed systematically protected. The afternoon session brought Freedman himself back to the stand, looking drained and edgy. He tried defending the footage as out of context, insisting Elinor had provoked him. But Marcella's cross-examination shredded that excuse. Freedman admitted under oath that he couldn't recall Elinor raising her voice. His claims of being threatened boiled down to an impression he got from her. Even Freedman seemed to realize how flimsy it sounded. As the day concluded, Freedman's lawyer called for an abrupt recess until the following morning, clearly needing time to regroup. Elinor stepped into the corridor, weighed down by exhaustion but buoyed by progress. That was when Freedman cornered her. His face was lined with stress, eyes simmering with fury. "You're making a scene out of nothing," he growled, voice dangerously low. "Give this up, or you'll regret going down this path." Elinor felt a spike of adrenaline, but she forced calm. "I've come too far to back off," she replied softly. His lips twisted. "Then don't be surprised when you find yourself in deeper trouble than you can handle." Before she could speak, Freedman stalked off, leaving her heart thrumming against her ribs. Marcella, who'd come around the corner, placed a steadying hand on Elinor's shoulder. "He's getting desperate," she said. "All the better for us, unless he tries something reckless." Elinor nodded, trying to quell her racing pulse. "I know, but if we handle this right, we'll get more than just a dismissal of his lawsuit. We can expose everything." They parted ways. Driving home, Elinor replayed Freedman's warning in her head, half wondering if he'd do something dangerously foolish. She slept fitfully, her mind brimming with strategic angles, potential evidence, half-formed nightmares of Freedman looming with malicious glee. The next morning, the courtroom brimmed again with reporters, local activists, spectators itching for a dramatic showdown. Freedman walked in with a rigid posture, his face pale but determined. His lawyer's expression was grim, words muttered in Freedman's ear. Elinor couldn't catch them, but her instincts flared. Something was afoot. Sure enough, Freedman's counsel produced a short video clip supposedly depicting Elinor confronting another officer in the city weeks prior. The officer in the video had a partial resemblance to Freedman, but the footage was grainy and spliced, details fuzzy. Freedman's lawyer presented it theatrically, claiming it showcased Elinor's propensity to harass police. Elinor felt her pulse quicken. The judge allowed a brief viewing. The clip was abrupt and strangely edited, showing a woman's face from the side, shouting something inaudible. Marcella immediately requested a recess to authenticate the video. Freedman's team objected, but the judge permitted an analysis. During that break, Elinor and Marcella huddled with a video forensic specialist. The moment he examined the clip, he frowned. "Metadata's been tampered with," he muttered. "Frames look spliced from two separate recordings." Elinor's chest felt tight. If Freedman had gone so far as to fabricate evidence, the ramifications could be huge. Marcella's brows knitted. If we can prove Freedman planted this, his entire case collapses even more dramatically. They hurried back, updated the judge, and the judge adjourned for the day to allow thorough analysis. Freedman's face was a peculiar mix of rage and fear. His attorney appeared equally anxious. The tension soared to near feverish levels. Later that evening, Marcella contacted Elinor with a definitive conclusion. The video was doctored, spliced from random police interactions. The woman featured wasn't even Elinor in half the frames. In essence, Freedman had either orchestrated or accepted patently false evidence. The following day saw a packed courtroom. Freedman's attorney stood rigid, sweat beading under bright lights. Marcella presented the forensic expert's findings with calm intensity. The judge's expression hardened. Freedman glowered, posture radiating rebellion. "Officer Freedman," the judge said, voice chiseled with authority, "did you knowingly submit falsified footage?" A hush so absolute it felt crushing fell over the room. Freedman's lawyer half rose, stammering disclaimers. We had no knowledge of any tampering, Your Honor." Yet Freedman remained silent, gaze sliding from the judge to the jury, then to Elinor. He looked cornered and furious. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he stood with a jerk of his shoulders. "This entire thing is a setup," Freedman roared. "You're all ganging up on me." Chaos flared, gasps, hushed exclamations. The judge banged the gavel, demanding order. Freedman's attorney tried pulling him down by the sleeve, but Freedman shook off the attempt. He pointed a trembling finger at Elinor. "Don't think you're safe," he snarled, raw anger crackling in his voice. "You're messing with something bigger than you know." The judge's patience snapped. She threatened to hold him in contempt if he didn't sit. Freedman relented, barely, sinking into the chair with venomous eyes. The jury was rattled. Freedman's meltdown was too obvious to ignore. When the hearing resumed, Freedman's attorney requested to withdraw the entire lawsuit, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Marcella swiftly objected, asserting that Freedman's malicious lawsuit shouldn't be dismissed without consequences. The judge, plainly irritated by Freedman's antics, agreed to proceed despite the plaintiff's retreat. Elinor recognized Freedman's panic. He wanted out of the very spotlight he'd triggered. But she was determined to see it through to the end. She recalled a conversation she'd had with a local police reform activist who'd once confided, "If you want to defeat a bully, you have to show the world what he really is." Freedman had shown himself, but there was still more. A key witness took the stand, a quiet ex-officer named Hector Mason, who had once served alongside Freedman. Nervously adjusting his tie, Mason recounted that Freedman had boasted about teaching certain people a lesson. Freedman had repeatedly manipulated paperwork, used intimidation tactics, and bragged he could bury complaints. On cross-examination, Freedman's counsel tried to discredit Mason as disgruntled. But Mason's calm sincerity rang true. While Freedman seethed, Elinor glimpsed the bigger picture. Freedman's confidence came from a network of support. She just needed to unearth it. During a recess, Marcella received a call from Internal Affairs agent Damian Miles, someone with whom Elinor had once collaborated on a different corruption story. Her phone rang. She listened briefly, eyes sharpening. "Miles wants to talk," Marcella told Elinor. "He says Freedman's ties run deeper than we realized." Sure enough, as soon as court adjourned, a stocky man in a dark suit stepped forward outside the main entrance, identifying himself as Agent Miles. He greeted Elinor and Marcella with polite urgency. "We've suspected Freedman was part of a wider ring of misconduct. Fabricated charges covering for more senior officials," Miles explained. "Your evidence in court is sending shockwaves. We want your cooperation." Elinor pressed her lips together. "What exactly do you need?" Miles described how Freedman was rumored to have acted on instructions from higher-ups. Freedman's meltdown on the stand, his cryptic warnings that "this isn't just about me," hinted at an entire system that was rotting. But working with Internal Affairs was risky. Freedman's protective web might include powerful figures who didn't appreciate infiltration. Nevertheless, Elinor's life work had always been shining light into dark corners. She nodded. "We'll do what we can." "But Freedman can't suspect we're teaming up," Miles concurred. "Let him keep his focus on the lawsuit. The more he flails, the more evidence we can gather." Over the next days, Freedman's case continued to crumble. Former interns, lower-ranked officers, and even frightened citizens came forward. It was as though Freedman's meltdown emboldened them to speak. One by one, they told stories of Freedman bending facts, filing false statements, smearing reputations whenever it suited him. Freedman watched, pallid, seemingly out of countermoves. Then a rumor reached Elinor's ears. Freedman had been overheard talking to an unknown associate about destroying crucial evidence. The possibility filled her with dread. Freedman, cornered, might go to extreme lengths. Marcella and Elinor alerted Miles, who began quiet surveillance. Tensions climbed to a boiling point when Freedman erupted once again in open court. He leaped up, voice cracking with desperate fury, spouting accusations that Elinor had conspired with the entire department. The judge threatened to cite him for contempt if he didn't compose himself. Freedman sat, trembling with rage. Elinor, for her part, refused to be intimidated, though her nights were punctured by anxious thoughts. She recognized Freedman's fear and knew it spelled danger. After a particularly tense hearing, Freedman disappeared from the courthouse, ignoring the press. That evening, Marcella phoned Elinor with a worried tone. Freedman hadn't shown up to his next shift at the station. His phone was off. No one had seen him. Miles confirmed Freedman was off the grid. "We suspect he's meeting with certain allies," Miles said. "If he's truly part of a larger ring, we might be able to catch them red-handed." Sure enough, a tip reached Elinor from a sympathetic officer she'd interviewed months prior. Freedman had been spotted near an abandoned factory in the waterfront district, rumored to be the site of clandestine meetups. Elinor relayed the intel to Miles, who rallied a small team to set up surveillance. Marcella insisted on accompanying Elinor despite the risk. And so, late one night, they parked discreetly near the corroded fence of that old factory. The faint stench of algae and salt water drifted on the breeze. Elinor's heart hammered as she watched dark silhouettes moving inside. Freedman was among them, raising his voice in heated argument. Another figure stepped forward, broad-shouldered, hair flecked with gray. That had to be Freedman's superior contact, a man rumored to have deeper connections in the police hierarchy. Elinor recognized Freedman's posture, frustrated, cornered. She couldn't hear everything, but snatches drifted through broken windows. Phrases like cover-ups and shut her down, and we didn't count on this exposure. Freedman snarled that he wouldn't go down alone. The older man barked that Freedman had failed to keep a low profile. Just then, Agent Miles signaled his team to move. FBI jackets and internal affairs badges flickered into the open. "Police, hands up," someone shouted, the voice echoing within the steel rafters of the factory. Freedman spun, face twisted in shock. The older man cursed, fumbling toward a concealed weapon, but an agent knocked him flat. Elinor and Marcella, staying close behind Miles, watched Freedman sag under the weight of the moment. He tried a desperate lunge, but two agents tackled him. Freedman glared at Elinor, venom glinting in his eyes. "This is your fault," he spat, voice cracking with a blend of hate and panic. Elinor stood firm, her pulse surging with adrenaline. "You did this to yourself, Officer Freedman." He struggled, spewing curses. "You think this ends here? You have no idea what you set in motion." Miles and his team secured Freedman and the other men. One by one, they were led outside into the swirling red-blue lights of waiting patrol cars. Reporters, tipped off, began arriving with cameras capturing the explosive end to Freedman's illusions of invulnerability. In the days that followed, Freedman's immediate allies unraveled under interrogation, revealing a labyrinth of corruption that extended far beyond a single station. Names of high-ranking officials leaked out, bribery chains were exposed, internal affairs ramped up efforts to clean house. Freedman, realizing the bleakness of his predicament, cut a deal for a more lenient sentence in exchange for testifying against his superiors. He lost his badge, his status, and most of his illusions, but the lawsuit Freedman had filed against Elinor still sat on the docket, incomplete. Freedman's attorney, exhausted and humiliated, tried once more to withdraw it. The judge, unimpressed by Freedman's meltdown and obvious wrongdoing, formally dismissed the suit. On the record, stating Freedman's claims were entirely without merit and noting the court's disdain for his malicious intentions. As Elinor walked down the courthouse steps after that final hearing, she was mobbed by microphones. Yes, she confirmed, Freedman's lawsuit was gone. Yes, the truth about his actions had come to light. She offered no triumphant gloating, only a subdued sense of relief for justice served. Marcella stood beside her, smiling in quiet satisfaction. It was a bittersweet victory. Freedman's corruption had left scars on many innocent people. Elinor planned to write a thorough exposé, documenting Freedman's entire saga and the shadowy network behind him. She felt a deep responsibility to every victim who had never seen justice. When Freedman's superiors faced indictments, some of them forced to retire in disgrace, it confirmed the scale of the wrongdoing. Agent Miles kept Elinor updated. "You helped crack this wide open," he told her. "Sometimes you need a personal spark to ignite a broader investigation." Months passed. Freedman faced his sentencing, ultimately pleading guilty to falsifying records and civil rights violations. His once confident swagger gave way to a hollow stare as the judge handed down penalties. Marcella accompanied Elinor to the courthouse gallery, where they observed Freedman's downfall in silence. Outside, the press clamored for statements. Elinor stepped forward, clearing her throat. "This was never just about me," she said, voice resonating with calm conviction. "It's about a system that sometimes tolerates or even enables abuse of power. And it's about holding those people accountable so that no one, no matter how powerless they may feel, has to fear the very institutions meant to protect them." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Elinor sat at her desk. Clippings, printed documents, scribbled notes lay scattered like confetti. She realized with a wave of odd peacefulness that she could sleep more soundly now. Freedman was done. The corrupt ring was in shambles. She'd told the truth, despite intimidation and legal threats. At the window, she noticed the city lights, a mosaic of flickering hope and possibility. She scrolled through messages, finding one from Agent Miles. "Couldn't have done it without you." Elinor's lips quirked in a small smile. She typed back, "It was a group effort." Still, she felt that old stirring in her chest, the sense that her work wasn't finished. The city, the world, remained flawed, but at least there was one less predator hiding behind a badge. Elinor gazed out at the skyline, reflecting on an old quote her father used to recite. "Truth crushed to earth shall rise again." Despite all Freedman's attempts to bury it, the truth had surfaced with unstoppable force. The ordeal reminded her that everyone has an obligation to demand accountability from those entrusted with power. She thought of all the people Freedman had hurt, all those who lack the resources or voice to stand up. If her journey taught her anything, it was that silence doesn't protect anyone. Only shining a bright, unwavering light on wrongdoing forces it to retreat. She recalled the final image of Freedman's face as he was hauled away. He had whispered a threat, but the threat no longer frightened her. She recognized that his real fear was the truth, the unstoppable, unflinching truth that would keep unraveling the system he'd once relied on. And so the day ended not with fireworks, but with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Elinor closed her laptop, inhaled the cool night air drifting through a half-open window, and marveled at the calm. In that moment she felt older, wiser, and ever more certain that every risk she'd taken had been worthwhile. Yet she knew the city's story, and her story would continue. No single case, no matter how dramatic, could fully uproot the seeds of corruption. But the seeds of reform had also been planted, nurtured by determined investigators, attorneys, honest officials, and yes, journalists like her who refused to be cowed by intimidation. Sometimes the wheel of justice turns agonizingly slowly. Sometimes you have to shove it yourself to make it move. Elinor Reyes had done just that, and the reverberations would be felt for years. In the quiet of that night, she penned the first lines of her newest article, unsure where the final page would lead her, but determined to see it through. She leaned back, closed her eyes, recalling another favorite saying that might resonate with anyone who has found themselves standing at the cliff edge of adversity. Better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. She was living proof that a single candle, be it a question posed in court or an unyielding piece of investigative work, could illuminate enough darkness to topple a vile structure built on lies. And that, she reflected, was one of the most enduring lessons she could share. We learn from these events that change often begins with one small refusal to submit to wrongdoing. It can be terrifying to speak up, to stand alone when powerful forces try to silence you. Yet courage, even when it trembles, can be enough to tip the scales in favor of justice. Middle age has taught many of us that time is precious, and we have a responsibility to future generations. Letting evil go unchallenged leaves a terrible inheritance. By confronting threats head-on, we protect not only ourselves, but those who come after us. There is also the importance of persistence. As the old proverb goes, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Sometimes that first step is taken in fear, sometimes in anger, but ultimately it leads us forward. Elinor's story was a testament that unwavering persistence, combined with moral conviction, can reveal the roots of corruption. Without persistence, Freedman's cruelty might have remained hidden. Without her refusal to yield, the people Freedman had harmed would never see any semblance of justice. Perhaps the biggest lesson is to trust in the possibility of redemption for institutions. When a corrupt system faces sunlight, it can be forced to change, or at least be shaken enough for reformers to gain ground. The enemies of truth thrive in shadows. Shine a light persistently enough and watch them scatter. Truth crushed to earth shall rise again was an anchor for Elinor, and it can be for anyone who wonders if their lonely voice matters. Let Freedman's downfall stand as a reminder that the loudest threats often come from those who fear truth the most. By countering them with evidence, calm resolve, and collaboration among people of goodwill, we find the strength to set wrongs right. In this way, we honor those who can't fight for themselves. We give hope to the voiceless. We demonstrate that even when intimidation looms large, there is power in unity and in one's steadfast refusal to accept injustice. And that, in the end, is how a single person, armed with integrity, unwavering curiosity, and the willingness to act, can illuminate the darkest corners of a flawed world.